Tony's going to be the first one to present here. This is can sometimes run long, so I might cut it off if it does go a little long. If you just want to raise your hand in your video or put up a little reaction here, like one of these guys, whenever you want to speak. If you could keep yourself muted until so, just so we don't have too many people talking over each other. And I'll call on you once that goes. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Tony.
Cool. Hey, thanks. Thanks, guys. And thanks, everybody, for taking a few moments out of your day and joining us. Brennan, don't try to call me right now, buddy. Hey, so what I like to do is I like to present something, an idea that I had on ride versus drive. Before I get into this, I just want to throw something at you guys. This idea, this concept is not in any manual. It's not science, right? You're not going to find any set definitions to this. This is based off of my experiences as a trainer, as an instructor, and as a snowboarder. From my experiences riding all over the U.S. and all over the world, going to interskis. I've been to several interskis, and then also a lot of my experiences down in New Zealand and riding in different snow conditions. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and pop this up onto the screen. Let me just share this real quick with you guys. Oop, let me just hold on 1 second. 1 second. Oops. Stand by. Share. Oh, where is it? Struggling. Where is it?
Mike, go upstairs and help Tony.
God, why is it not popping up? Hold on. 1 second. Why is it not? Ay. Wait, that's why. Cool. Okay. Why is this not sharing? There we go. Cool. All right. Before we get into this, so what I like to do real quick before we get into this, if you think of this idea of ride versus drive, I'm going to go ahead and break this down in several different ways here. I'm going to break it down into what is ride versus drive and the idea of that. And I'm going to use an analogy of like driving a car versus riding your snowboard, right? And kind of use that analogy to kind of break this idea and this concept down. Then I'm going to go ahead and take that through our understanding of snowboarding through our certification process, 1, 2, 3, and RMT. And then from there, I'll go ahead and take that into the actual movements that we make on our snowboard, and then finally breaking it down to some of the applications. And again, as I was saying before, this is just an idea, just a concept I want to kind of throw at you guys. So you guys, when we, as we're going through this, I'm going to go ahead and take you guys through this whole presentation, and then at the end, you guys can go ahead and question and debate. Before we get into this, what I'd like you guys to do is raise a hand. I'm going to go ahead and throw out a couple ideas here for you. Raise your hand raise your right hand if you think it's ride, and your left hand if you think it's drive. So if I were to say maybe like a task like the level 3 carve, right? Which for Rocky Mountain, the level 3 carve task would be large. He's already raising his hand. Large carve close, flex the edge change to active retraction, showing some separation in your forward stance. Raise your right hand for drive and left hand for ride. Brennan, you can't hold 2 hands. You got to choose one. Okay, cool.
Brennan, you're cheating.
Be decisive, Brennan. Okay, the next one I'll throw out there is just the like a cert 1 carve, right? which is the extended at edge change in your forward stance. All right, open turns on green terrain. Yeah, there you go. Okay, cool. So see some left hands going up. Okay, so as we go through this, think about that and stick to those ideas. We'll come back to that at the end of this. So ride versus drive. Think about it like as driving a car, right? A passenger versus a driver. Are you in control of the board, or are you just happen to be strapped to it? As we get into this, we're going to go through the level one. The idea of the level one rider, as we all know, it's pretty much riding your basic stance, pretty aligned most of the time, right? As we get into it, think about it like driving a car. It's that boring driver, the person who's got two hands on the wheel all the time, kind of like driving Miss Daisy, super safe, will always get you from point A to point B, but it's not going to be a very flashy drive, and you probably don't want to talk to them much because they need to pay attention, kind of like your student driver, right? Then as we move into like level two, a level two snowboarder is starting to understand movement options. They start to understand how to use upper body versus lower body, front leg versus back leg, right? They start to understand different joints, how to use different joints at different times through a turn, right? As it pertains to like driving a car, for example, they might understand how to use the cruise control option. They start pushing different buttons in the car. They understand the difference between using like a sport drive and an econ drive, right? They might also be able to drive their car in different situations, like in the snow and pumping the brakes and being able to oversteer their car a little bit. So they might feel a little bit more versatile in different snow, road conditions, right? Then as you move into the level three, this is the ride anything, anytime, anywhere sort of rider, right? That's how we always kind of describe that. Their ability to blend movements to get more performance out of their snowboard. What does that look like as a driver? Well, this is that driver that actually starts to hit the gas a little bit more than the brake on their car. They start to be able to accelerate out of turns and start getting more performance out of the car. Start to really work that car and start revving it up with the RPMs and some downshifting to build some friction and stuff like that. So the person that has more control over their vehicle is the idea. So what is that RMT level of riding, right? I always describe RMT riding as like level three is anything, anytime, anywhere, right? Anything, anytime, anywhere. But RMT is more anything, anytime, anywhere, and anyhow, right? So your ability to do that same movement pattern or same riding utilizing different movement patterns. So what does this look like as far as driving? That would be being able to drive any vehicle, whether it's a truck to a sports car, right? Being able to drive a manual versus an automatic. So you're starting to get some idea there, right? Of this whole idea of ride versus drive. Now, how does it pertain to actually bring them back to snowboarding? So again, we're going to talk about the ride versus drive as far as movements, right? You guys probably are aware of this, active versus passive or reactive versus active here. So think of it like this. As we get through this, we're going to go through TID. We're going to kind of hold the R off to the side. We're not going to get into rate. Some of you guys might look at TIRD. We're going to just take into TID here. As we do this, think about the how you're becoming active and how you're becoming reactive as you go through this. So we'll look at pros and cons of this. So let's start out with timing, for example. We get into timing, some pros and cons for starting off with riding. Like when you're just riding and you're strapped on, you're being pretty reactive, right? You just happen to be like a pro to riding, and the timing. Things happen at the same time. In other words, when you're riding down the hill, and imagine if you look back at your homie and you hit a bump. Well, you're not going to make a movement before you hit the bump. Your legs are going to move as you hit your bump, because say you didn't see that bump because you were looking back at your homie. So it happens at the same time. So that's a pro. So things are happening at the same time as you need it to happen. A con of that would be that you're not prepared for it, right? You get out of balance. You're not able to make that reaction. You're not able to kind of tense up your core. You're not able to get a slight flex maybe through your spine to be able to deal with that action of your legs coming up underneath the body. Getting into that, obviously, the drive side of that, more the active side of it, as you can see, you're ready for it. You can anticipate that. However, sometimes anticipation, it could be your worst tool, as sometimes you tend to be too early. You get a little nervous. You might make a movement too early, or you might anticipate it and be too late with it because you're trying to do too much, right? So let's keep moving through this. Let's get into some intensity. Again, measurement matches the need with the pro for the ride. Again, how much you move, the range in which you move now is going to match what you're going to need to do to be able to absorb a bump, right? On the con side of that, you might not be prepared for that much movement. Sometimes you hit a smaller bump versus a bigger bump. You're not prepared for that larger range. Get into the drive side. You're ready to manage the forces that are going to be created from that movement or from that interaction with that bump, because you're able to anticipate that and to preempt that movement a little bit. Again, it's easy to not get that measurement right, though, if you're trying to match how much you're going to move versus what you need. So just being aware of that. And then finally, that duration piece, fits what's needed. The idea there, and the stamina depleted, the idea of fits what's needed is that when you go into that and you're riding and you're just riding, again, the amount in which you move, not just the amount, but for the length of time in which you make that movement, is going to be set, because it's just, you're allowing that board to go over that piece of terrain or engage whatever that might be. To me, like a great idea of that is somebody that matches their board against terrain in like a half pipe or transition. Those people that are really good at matching the board to terrain. Again, you allow the board to match that terrain because you're just allowing it for what's needed, but not trying to add too much extra. On the flip side of that, when you're being too active and you're driving too much, the amount of energy that you use might not match the need. The posture in which you get into might be too much. You might get too low. Sometimes when people try to be too active, they get really low and stuff like that, which could be great, but it could also be more difficult to match that need as well. So just being aware of that. So as we move from there, as we kind of take it into the actual applications, right? You think about an Indy car versus a rally car. Think about that skidded turn, that carved turn. The idea is that in a skidded application, I like to talk to you guys now about what it looks like to override and overdrive it, because this is what happens a lot, and this is what I found a lot. Just as we're training people, when people are trying to be passive or active, or in the situation which we're talking about is reacting too much, right? Is again, that whole idea of not being able to close off your turn and not getting any rebound, because that overriding is that person who just happens to be standing on that board and letting the board slide underneath their feet, not doing a lot, not getting a lot from it, right? That level one, maybe somebody that's not that doesn't have a lot of experience riding, maybe they're a little more fearful, so they're not doing much with the board, they just happen to be strapped to it. Where somebody that goes down the hill and the sweat's coming out of their helmet, maybe they're doing too much, right? Maybe they're pivoting, they're kicking that back foot, and you're not getting as much performance from that board because you're pushing it too hard, pushing it through the turn and creating a lot of tilt and chatter at the end of that turn. What does it look like in the IndyCar scenario when we're carving, right? In this situation, you can, again, having a hard time shaping that turn when you're riding, and you're not actually guiding the board through the turn as much. You're not able to create that rebound, that match of flexion extension, and a little bit of rotation as you steer the board through that carved turn. You're not able to really take advantage of that rebound that you're building through that turn. Whereas if you overdrive it, again, generally people will overdrive more on their toe edge than they will on their heel edge. You see people will create a higher edge angle on their toe edge than they will on their heel edge. And a lot of that is built through, not having the ability to utilize those ankles as much as they can on that heel edge versus that they can on that toe edge. So the whole idea of this, the whole premise of this idea is knowing when to and how to scale it, how to scale that ride versus drive as you move through there, right? Do we want to be on one side or the other side? And ideally, that perfect blend is your ability to match board to terrain first and foremost, right? That's the most important thing. From there, being able to push and pull against that board to create and manage some of those forces to in turn create better performance underneath that board. That's kind of the idea of this whole ride versus drive. So a lot of people, as they're going through the system and they're going through the certification process and you're going through training, you first learn how to ride your snowboard, right? Stand on top of the thing in a centered stance. But as you do that, what happens is that people will tend to get too complacent. And when they do that, they start getting into more difficult terrain. There's going to be a time when you're going to need to start to drive that thing a little bit more. And how much they drive it and being able to measure how much they put into it, whether it's flexion, extension, or rotational movement patterns, is gonna give them feedback as to whether they're over driving it or over riding it. And that's the idea of this idea here. Is real kind of a simple concept, but really it could be something that could be quite influential as to why you are or aren't achieving what you're trying to achieve as you snowboard. So this is just an idea that, again, that I've built up in my head over the years as I'm giving people feedback and things like that. And as I see people being successful with a task and unsuccessful with a task. And last talk, KB was talking about, I think, about how Conrad, when he rides, he's able to ride at a super high edge angle and uses his edges quite well. But the way he's able to do that is because he sprinkles in a bit of riding and a bit of driving. If he were to do that and he was just to drive it all the time, it would be blowing out. And I've had a firsthand experience with this sort of situation. When I first went to New Zealand for the first time, I came from riding in Colorado, dry snow, and I'm pushing it. And, I was a level 3 and a level 1 examiner. I was a new level 3 and became an examiner. And I went to New Zealand and I was doing all these crazy retraction carve turns. I get to the snow in New Zealand. It's a bit more firm, a bit icier. And I was slamming all the time, bouncing my face off the snow a couple times. So again, over driving it and not letting the board ride along the terrain. So again, being able to scale that movement pattern down a little bit to ride a little bit more when I'm in New Zealand on icier conditions. And then when I get here in Colorado on better snow conditions and something that's a little bit more predictable, I'm able to drive it a little bit more. So I'd like to throw that out there. I'm sure there's all kinds of debates. I'm going to throw that out there and send that out to you guys, and you guys go ahead and debate it, and let's have a conversation over it.
All right, let's go Brennan, then Hodgrave. You're muted, Brennan.
Talking to myself, that was fun. Now, Tony, I love that last point of it's easy to see driving as a positive, maybe a little more so than riding, because we love getting performance. I appreciate you bringing up that New Zealand example, because that is the truth. We don't always want to be driving, but so it was cool you kind of finished with that, because I think that allows for people to actually move through it. But the one place I had a question is, you talk like turn versus turn, like driving through a turn or riding through a turn. And I was just curious if you break that down when you're giving feedback or when you're observing to like phases of the turns or parts of the turn. Because that's where my hands were doing this, is I'm like, man, I'm pretty drivey through like most of the turn at Cert 3 cars, but there's definitely a point where I'm chilling and I'm going towards riding and so forth. Or do you like to stay in that like through a turn, because you were referencing?
Hey, that's a great question. Thanks for that, Brennan. And absolutely, where we want to be, for example, in a carve turn, on something a little bit steeper, like a steep blue or black, the more active we can be at the top of that turn, then the less active we need to be at the bottom of that turn. So the more we can manage some of that pressure, get on that early edge early, and then we can get a little bit more feedback and something back from that board at the end, where we can be a little bit more passive, where we get that the rebound from the board, and then we can redirect it. Do we go all the way to ride at the end of that turn? No, probably not. But the fact that we can move that scale from the beginning to the end of one turn, absolutely. And also, it might be different from what you do on one turn to the next turn. A great example of that too would be like as you're going over a roller, or as you're dealing with a double fall line, for example, you might be a little bit more active on the bottom of that fall line versus the top of that fall line, or vice versa. So great point.
Tony, man, nice job. This is a really cool way to look at things. I really appreciate how much thought you put into it. And I started thinking about my life in general, especially like my relationship with my wife. In my too heavy ride or too heavy drive at different times. And like, I know I'm screwing it up most of the time. I don't know about the rest of you. So I meant, and I only meant on the emotional sense. I wasn't going somewhere weird. But the question I have for you is, would you be willing to just, throw together a list, like a hit list of exam tasks and or, different writing skills that you really reflect on through this lens, and maybe just kind of show us how you align, like, what's ride and what's drive a little bit, just so, because I'd like to understand more. You have so much experience developing this. I'd like to hear more of like how you apply this as an examiner trainer, but maybe just a quick hit list so I could see it through that lens.
Yeah. Hey, that's a great idea there. And again, when we think about like the tasks, and especially for some of you guys that are, most of you guys are Rocky Mountain, but any of you guys that come from other divisions, that the task list that we use at exams is all to be able to pull skills from those tasks. So for example, like a task that everyone kind of points to me at, that I use quite often and I really liked, is, for example, like a dolphin turn. Right, a dolphin turn is quite active movement, and I think about driving the board, driving from the nose to the tail of the board, and you're driving in several different realms, from a flexion extension perspective and a rotational perspective, trying to dive down the rotation a little bit and trying to drive up the flexion extension. Whereas like something that would be a little bit less like that would be, for example, like, being able to going and doing, where maybe like a board slide on a box, for example, you'd be quite active at the beginning of that movement, and then being able to ride it and let that board match that box, and just being able to keep it flat and being able to drive it, versus people get in trouble sometimes when they're in a board slider and they're trying to slide on metal or plastic, when they try to drive it too much and they try to add too many reactive movements to it. So I guess that those could be some examples, but I would say there's probably quite a few examples like that I'm sure this group could also share.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you, man.
Yeah.
Sweet. Does anybody else have any questions or comments for Tony? Yeah, Spicky.
Hey guys. So Tony, can you? Awesome. We have this trainer on staff that brought up the difference between being posed versus poised. And so when you spoke about what you were talking about as far as the difference from one thing to another, as far as like having those, like, what do I say? The variations in pressure management and having that expertise to deal with that. And so that made me think of Jimbo's poised versus posed. And what he meant was, like, we get into a posed position and we hold it. As what he talks about with being poised is we're constantly moving and constantly balancing and moving through movements. And so that's kind of, I just wanted to kind of make sure that, is that kind of what I'm getting from you a little bit?
That's a great way of thinking about it. I would say a little bit in there, but I'd say there's a point in which I wouldn't tell or want anybody to just ride in a position. And to me, that would be what he's talking about, is posed, I guess. Right. So I wouldn't want anybody to ride in a set position for an extended period of time. Again, that would be the low end of that scale, closer to the full on, just straight up riding side, where I would want a little bit of drive, a little bit of ability to move, because as we know, we're always kind of working on balance, right? And dynamic balance is the most important element, being that if something's moving underneath us, we need to be moving on top to stay within dynamic balance. So a little bit of that would be more on that other side of that idea there. But I think that's a great way of being able to describe things from a student's perspective. And that, it's a funny thing, because we always, we talk about the basic stance to our students, and we say, hey, here's the basic stance, and we show a position. And it's weird because that position is not the ideal position, because it always seems to be like a flat board when we show that position. But how often do we ride on a flat board? So it's kind of a funny one. We're constantly moving from one edge to another edge, and we're making subtle adjustments as we do that. Yeah, I think again, that's a scaling. It's a real difficult scale, but and it's a pretty micro scale too, as we get into that ability to be able to go from an absolute standstill position to making subtle adjustments, say it in our ankles and things like that, which might not look like major movements, but they are crucial movements.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I know Brennan had a follow-up question, or maybe a different question as well.
Yeah, when Hargrave was asking the question, something that kind of came up for me was the relationship between stance and this. And that at first I was thinking that it's easier to ride when you're in an efficient stance, maybe like kind of if you're just trying to hold force through a turn, like in a carved turn, you've started the turn and you've had force built. And if you're in a proper stance, you might be able to ride through different phases. But I was just wondering how you approach that, Tony, with, I don't know, trainings or certs in terms of the relationship between stance and this concept, because that goes straight to a car, right? Like suspension is different in different cars and will afford different ride and drive options, I think.
Yeah, sure. So I think that gets in, I remember a while back going on a clinic from a gentleman out of the West way back in the day. He was talking to me about the idea of positions of power and being in a stance that can allow you to add movements from small joints versus large joints, and having that full range from a particular stance. So I think, is that kind of what you're talking about? Is that?
Yeah, I was just thinking about, in particular with riding, which potentially could be a bit more passive, maybe not exploring as much movement, maybe not having as much intensity. I think subtle stance challenges or inefficiencies could become more present in outcomes, could become more challenging in outcomes when you're riding. Yeah. I think sometimes we can cover stance inefficiencies or challenges with driving. I think we kind of can get away with some things because we can kind of move our board towards our center of mass or whatever, even if our stance is a little off. So it's just kind of a thought to add to yours. I think stance can kind of play into those ability to access riding or driving for an outcome.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think one application where it's really easy to see this is like riding pipe, for example. We talk about like if you ever spent much time with Boyd, as I know several of you guys on this call have, right? He'll talk about riding in a slightly more open stance so that he can drive the board a little bit, and how he stands, where he's like, too many instructors try to stay too aligned in the half pipe and things like that, right? And it's not conducive to what we're trying to do. But on the flip side of that, I think, in my opinion, I think instructors, the reason why, and I've said this to a lot of you guys before, is I think the reason why some instructors have a hard time riding pipe is because they try to drive too much. They do too much. We teach so many people to absorb terrain, and they're driving and they're anticipating and they absorb that transition versus standing on the thing and letting it happen, right? So there are some situations there where that doing less is more, and that's where a good stance can allow you to do that. So that's a great point, Brennan.
Hargrave.
Hey, just to add on to that, I was thinking it as you guys were talking, and it's so true. I mean, for years, going through, working exams and different things, people talk about continuous movement and fluid movement and all this sort of thing, but there is a time to turn off the movement and just go with it, and relax and enjoy snowboarding. And there's a time to turn it on and fire it up, and that changes like turn to turn on a lot of runs. I mean, especially if you're riding anything, situational like bumps. And I remember I was having a conversation with a coach years ago at High Cascade. I was training the coaches there, and the coach said something about that open stance to me. And they were like, well, I don't buy into all that AASI bullshit, riding with your shoulders aligned and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, well, neither do I necessarily, but why don't you? And I kind of asked the question. He's like, because if I open my shoulders, I can see where I'm going better. I'm like, that makes perfect sense. And guy was a high level pro rider. And I just looked there and I said, well, when you're talking to your students, just remember that whatever you do with your body, you have to communicate to your students how to overcome it so that they can compensate for it. And that's just it. Like, we can be very dynamic, as you're saying, and we can literally get into that open stance and create power and stand on it and do all kinds of things, you know, loading the tail and the edge and that sort of thing. But there's a time for that where it works, and there's a time where it doesn't. And the more I, you know, think about how you frame this up through riding and driving, so to speak, passive, active, however you want to look at it, it's just a great way to frame it up and go, okay, well, this is a time to ride and this is a time to drive, and let's know the difference between the two and when to turn it on and when to, and it's funny because I always tell people, you know, you should ride hungry for a sensation, right? You should be getting something out of your turn, getting something out of the terrain, feeling something from it. Because when you feel something, then and it feels good anyways, you want to do it again, and it makes sense. And it generally leads to a really good picture. And for me, it's like looking at your model here, it's like, all right, there's a time when you get something out of being passive, you know, just cruising on an edge and feeling that thing lock in. And there's a time where you get real dynamic and start moving and start adding things and get a lot out of that. And it's just awesome to appreciate both and recognize that you don't have to constantly be moving and overpowering things. You can actually just work with the turn and the terrain that you're working with. And I think that's, you know, sort of ideal. Anyways, thank you. Really nice topic, Tony.
Maybe here. I got a quick question for you, Tony. As we talk about high intensity bump riding, black pitches, double black pitches, even off piece, right, and your skidded turns, I think your ride versus drive happens so quickly from turn to turn. What are some thoughts on how you manage that and make that smoother and understand in those short snippets, when do I drive and when do I ride?
That's a great point, KB. And I would say the biggest way to be able to do that is straight up experience. And that goes back to the old idea, is that some of us try to push through in like, I think the more you can have experience in different snow conditions, in different situations, in different techniques, and different tasks, and just riding, you know, riding fast versus riding slow. I think we always want to try to go harder and faster and things like that. And I think people, when they're trying to increase their riding, they're always trying to turn up the dial. Where I think a lot can be learned from turning down the dial as well. And I think that side of things is sometimes we don't see that. So for example, trying to go down those big, gnarly, steep bumps as slow as you can, see what you get from that, as far as the timing of your movements, the movements you use, and the reactions you get from those movements. I think that would be a great way to kind of play with things, trying to carve as slow as possible. I remember doing a clinic years ago with Steve Ochko, and he had me work on carving slow, because I was a guy that at the time I was just slamming it up on edge and trying to carve it. He's like, try to carve slow with a low edge angle. And that did wonders for my carving, because then I was instead of trying to carve, I was trying to eliminate pivot in my snowboard, and I was actually pulling the back leg into the snow, which was a great idea. So just kind of going out there and experimenting with turning the dial up and turning the dial down will allow you to see and react, and then you'll be able to quickly change from that ride versus drive, because you'll have more experiences doing it through, whether that's through one turn or whether that's through a series of turns. But I think the biggest thing overall, like I said at the beginning of this, is experience. Experience is key. Experiences you have yourself and experiences you see other people having.
Cool. Jake Zopes.
Well, thanks. Yeah, kind of to that point, Tony and KB, when I looked at going towards my RMT, and Tony's idea of an RMT is you can drive any car and you can be stick or manual. I think it's another step further of like, you can take that Indy car to the rally course, and you can take you to the Indy track, whatever it is. But taking it out, thank you. Thanks, Conrad. Sorry. But yeah, like being able to turn it up and turn it down, and I don't know, I always coined it as like riding weird. Like take all of those cert 1, 2, and 3 things and you know, if you've been a trainer and you've helped people towards certifications, all the things that you've told them, hey, you need to do this or you need to do that for level 1 or level 2 or level 3, go try to do it wrong or do it against your advice. Like, figure out the whys behind it and just ride as different as possible. I know I spent days in like absolutely low vis light, just trying to like get down a bump section as fast as I can, but keeping my board, you know, across the fall line, and just absorbing and playing with low edge angle stuff, or even doing like GS turns through the gnarliest bump run on your mountain, you know, just playing with that ability to ride the way that you're not supposed to, maybe on that given run or that given snow. But that fact of taking the IndyCar and putting it in the desert and whatever you need to do to make it something different, that's what makes you that level, that RMT rider. You're no longer just using the vehicle for what it's for, but using it for what it's not for.
Yeah, exactly. Nice.
Dana had a question.
Or not a question, just I like what you said. You can learn it by experience or by watching someone as well. And that just reminded me of like what you see on the Freeride World Tour. You have a starter. And the purpose of the starter is not only for the judges to see the terrain, like the conditions, how everything's riding, how's the snow reacting, what section of the venue is the most challenging, what section of the venue has great powder, but it gives the athletes a chance to see how the snow is reacting under their board, because then they know, like, all right, if I'm going to be riding here, I want to be driving. If I'm riding there, I want to be more riding. Maybe it's super duper slick or something, or if I'm going to land there, definitely ride it for a while. So I like that because I can relate it to something that I know very well.
Sweet. Anybody else? Anybody? I was just going to ask one question. You talked a lot about, a lot of people have talked about that driving, and that can kind of overcome some deficiencies in people's riding. And I've noticed that especially for people moving towards that like Cert 2, Cert 3. And a lot of us here on this call are sometimes in the training realm. So I'd just like you to speak to a little bit how we can train to, and I know you touched on a couple of those like tasks real quickly, but how you can train to more of a riding versus a driving.
Yeah. I think going in and like doing things, going back to some of the fundamentals, right? And don't lose track of some of the fundamentals. Going back, and I always talk about this, is a huge one. Like first run in the pipe, first thing in the morning, drop into the pipe from side slipping into the middle and build from there, right? And the idea there is build from there, just a real low level, mellow, skidded turn, keeping your legs a little bit, maybe standing a little bit taller, and just feeling the interactions of the board and the wall and the transition, and feeling that the first couple of times, and then slowly dialing it up as you go, and then dropping in, obviously, with proper drop-ins as you go. But I think something like that, is a great example. Same thing when getting into, like, for example, carve turns, we want to go straight into like high level carve. Everyone wants to get super retraction going right off the bat. Well, do some carve turns where you're doing, a big old up and over movement, and get some of that, like changing that movement pattern to get a different timing sensation of the forces that are acting upon you. I think we get so stuck into those set tasks. And what is that set task? How is it supposed to relate? How is it supposed to feel? How is it supposed to look? And we can start losing track of what are all the other sensations that we're missing out on that we don't feel because we only set in these set tasks. So the more you can get comfortable to feeling different sensations from going back and doing extended at edge change turns and up on weight turns and things like that. And, more like, standing taller as you ride. Like a lot of you guys know me, I ride very low position. So if I go out and warm up, I might ride a little bit taller just to feel my boards being a little bit flatter instead of going edge to edge so quickly. Then I get to feel more different sensations, and I get to start training myself more intrinsic feedback from my board and the forces that are acting upon my board.
Sweet. Thanks very much for that, Tony. Is there anybody else who had any questions? Chandler. You're still muted, buddy.
I want to talk about more about personal riding as far as like training. If you overtrain or if you try to focus on something so much, you're gonna drive so hard, and it's gonna be harder to make something more of a ride. So if you're thinking about something so much, you're focused on something so much, you're gonna be driving like really hard. You're not really gonna feel the movement or feel that teaching style, whatever you're working on. Or if you just kind of relax and get the mileage in and make it come second nature, that's when it starts becoming more passive, more of a ride. But you gotta like set your mind free and get the drive in, but let the ride come in naturally, you know? You guys know what I'm saying? So you can't push yourself, you know? You gotta drive.
Anybody that's ridden with me.
So drive, but like once you start getting those feelings, let that muscle memory come in, make it become second nature, and let it become a more of a passive ride naturally, and it'll come. So just that's random.
I think, hey, Chandler, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think kind of what you're saying is like when you go out there and you're working on a skill, say that skill is absorption in your scenario of bumps, right? You could get frustrated when you're training so hard that you overdo the change that you make. You're like, oh, I need to absorb it more. So I'm gonna get really low. And all of a sudden you find yourself too low, right? So it's about making a smaller adjustment versus a larger adjustment. And as you make those smaller adjustments, feeling your way through it and being able to scale how much adjustment you need. And again, somebody from like a KB, like I've ridden with KB, and KB generally starts up here and he has to scale it down sometimes, where some of us start down here and we scale it up sometimes. So I think that's a great perspective.
Cool.
No, I agree with that, Tony. I think you hit on something that was very key for me, because I did have the experience that some of you may have. I spent a ton of time training, and I spend a ton of time training in that drive mode, because the higher you climb the certification standards, it's a drive. And then all of a sudden at the RMT level, they're like, oh, nope, I don't want you to drive as much, do that. And so I am just now really starting to get solid in some of the movements to understand that I don't always have to drive the car.
Perfect.
All right, guys. Sweet. We're going to move on here. We're going to go over to Brennan. Brennan's topic is maximizing your physiology, troubleshooting your physiology, and managing pros and cons of your physiology through the journey of AASI. So thanks very much, Tony. And we'll move it across to Brennan.
I was going to say, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I'm so sorry. I had my hand up and I don't think you saw me. I just wanted to say, and this might lead into Brennan's talk to begin with, but I've found in like riding in general and teaching a variety of age groups, I feel like this ride versus drive concept is really awesome, because not everybody has the endurance or the fitness to kind of last in that ride mode. And I've learned, and as I continue through my life, like teaching and riding and improving my abilities, that drive versus ride is super essential to like the longevity of you as you're on the mountain. So just, yeah. So.
Sweet. Thanks, Claire. Take it away, Brennan.
Following up T-Mac, I feel like I'm in an exam here. I'm all nervous. This is intense. Thanks, crew. Pretty solid stuff. We were finishing up the last meeting, and the group kind of requested some more hard skill stuff, some stuff that had to do with riding, because we trended towards soft skills in the group. And I was thinking something that's been on my mind this last year has been the role of physiology, like overall physiology, as a big picture item within hard skills. And just like Tony, I don't think we speak Tony's presentation. I don't think what I'm going to present here is necessarily specifically in our manuals. It's not necessarily in our pedagogy, but I think it's something that can be pretty powerful
Cool.
for ourselves, or the people we're training or the athletes we're working with. And yeah, I'm going to share some of my own personal struggles with things, sometimes where this concept has influenced my trajectory in challenging ways, sometimes where it influenced it in positive ways. And then we'd love to hear from the crew on how everyone approaches this, because this is pretty new for me. So it's a little bit of presentation, and I'd love some feedback on it for sure. So yeah, when I look at our system as a whole, we love our movement options. We present all these movements, and the entire idea is generating, as Tony was saying, and managing board performances. And you know, when we look at our manuals, it talks about all the things we can do with our physiology. We will be able to flex and extend. We will be able to rotate. We'll be able to manage TID. We will be able to have these outcomes, and we'll look like the little person in the manual. And that's great. The truth is, the further up the chain we go, the more that physiology, all of our unique physiologies can start to influence our ability to sort of achieve some of those outcomes, achieve some of those proficiencies that we look at. And it's interesting because our paradigm, like when we look at PSI as a whole, it says, hey, for your students, make sure you consider their physiological needs. You know, do they have past injuries? How's their fitness? And adjust your lesson for their physiology. So we kind of say, hey, concepts, and we're going to adjust it for the human in front of us. And yet for instructors going through certification, we do the opposite. It's like, hey, instructors, fit into this image. And I know that not everyone, leading exams, we don't require everyone to look the same, but I think in general, that truth is there. Like, hey, no matter your physiology, you're going to be expected to move certain ways, achieve certain outcomes, manage certain board performances, and you sort of have to figure it out. And frankly speaking, in my experience, not a lot of people spoke directly to my physiology. It was more like, hey, figure it out. And I'm not insulting the system, to be clear, because it makes sense that we have to achieve certain things. That's the entire idea behind standardizing something and believing in something and certifying something. So I'm not against the system, but I'd love for us to consider, when we're working through that system and helping people work through that system, to add in physiology as more of kind of a common idea to access. So I found myself in the past, when I'm like working with athletes or instructors, saying, hey, you know, maximize your physiology, maximize your strengths, you know, use those strengths, and then develop your weaknesses. That works for coordinating movements. I like that phrase for like kind of develop your weakness with movement, with coordinating options. What it doesn't work as well with is with physiological considerations. Hey, develop your physiology. That takes the power away from the human being, because I can't really change the fact that I am this body and that I've developed this way. So what I'd like to present there, and the key word that I'm going to kind of go after is the overarching theme in my presentation, is the idea of troubleshooting or problem solving with your physiology, in particular when it limits you, when it becomes challenging. So before I go down my own kind of experience and get a little more depth in this, I'm curious if anyone else in the group has kind of, in particular, how to struggle at times with feeling like their own body, their own physiology is kind of limiting them. And I'm guessing probably at like the level 3 or the RMT, it comes up, but also potentially in other realms of snowboarding. I'm just curious what other people have experienced.
Yeah, just go ahead and jump in, guys.
So one I've been working with, and it's not a personal thing, but it's instructor I've been working with for 5 years at Mount Snow. He got his teaching pass. He's working on a riding retake. He's like in his 70s. He has 2 totally fused ankles, like metal joints. They're not going to bend. And then last year he just broke his femur in a motorcycle accident. And so he's working with a bunch of limitations, and something we've just been talking about is like, we will figure out a way to get the board to do what we need it to. And as long as we can be really precise with little movements, then we can, like, similar to how we were talking about that ride and drive, like we have to ramp one thing up in the precision maybe and walk one thing down is like the flexibility range that he has. And so we've kind of been diving into like how we can make things work for him. So that it just popped into my head when you said that, Brennan.
Thanks, Amy. I think Maddie V from Conrad's.
Maddie V, Keith, Lynn, there was a few. Just jump in when the space goes.
Matty V, you don't have limitations. I know this, but maybe you've met someone that has this. I don't know.
You're still
Find a
muted.
way to make. Oh.
There you go.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's correct. I have no limitations. But no, I like what Amy said. I like what Amy said about we'll find a way to make the board do what it needs to do. And I think that's kind of the underlying principle, you know, like people's physiology. It's like that's a huge contributor to their own style. And so at some point, like, you got to start working on the board performance. And I think that's a key factor in this is focusing on what you need to do to get the board to do what you want it to do. It's going to look a little different for a lot of people.
Yeah. And that's already a great takeaway, which is the board is the bottom line. I've heard that from I think I've stolen that from someone probably in this call, but it's like, we want your body to, in general, in the system, kind of be able to demonstrate and present for trainees, for athletes. But if your board is doing what needs to be done for an outcome and it's predictable, like in general, that's probably a pretty positive thing, even if it looks different for myself versus Tony versus perfect Matty B.
Yeah. Hey, Brennan, I like this idea. And for those of you guys, like when you guys are running training and you're in front of the group, or you're an examiner and you're in front of the group, how many times do you get people in your group trying to ride like you, right? And like I get a lot of tall characters trying to ride like me, and I'm in a flex tiny stance. I'm like, don't try to ride like me, because I'm working on my own riding. And if you ever try to ride behind Tommy Bennett and try to ride like him, you're going to get really frustrated.
We're actually going to come back to that story later, Tony. I'm using you as an example of kind of the effects that people can have on you when they speak to your physiology, because you told me that in an RMT clinic, and it was a powerful moment for me. Yeah, we'll get back to that in just a little bit.
I think sorry, Lynn.
I think when we're working on riding a certain way, for example, for Cert 2 or Cert 3 movement or some kind of board performance or body option, we need to talk about how we can achieve it, because not everyone can achieve something like Tony achieves it, or like Brennan achieves it, or like I achieve it, or like anyone achieves it. But when we just say we have something, for example, I got told, or some of the feedback I received is that I have anterior pelvic tilt. And it's awesome to know what you have, but it's more effective to know how you can fix it and what you can do to fix it. Brennan, I see you pointing. Do you want to add something?
No, that's the classic example in our system where we do speak to physiology. And when I speak of physiology, I think we have a common ground, and I might not be using the word in its total completeness, but it's just the human being's physical proportions, the capability of their muscular system, their skeletal system, maybe overall coordination could be packaged in there. And APT is one of the places I think our system, the AASI system, actually speaks to a physiological consideration, which is like, hey, check this out. We'll get into my experience, but we've kind of put it as a gender thing, and it's not. So we're going to get back to that in just a second.
But it's not, it's biomechanical, and we all are different. It doesn't matter if we're male or female. It's how we stand on our board and how we make our board perform, and, for example, where our center of mass is at different times. And as we work through that with candidates, we can help them make the movements more effectively and get the ideal board performances at the ideal times.
I'd love to hear from one or two more, and then I might jump in just kind of.
Let's go with Keith and Claire.
As I've gotten older in this whole process of the game, certain like things physically have changed for me, such as faster twitch muscles and stuff like that. And I think earlier we hit on it. It's like changing those movement patterns to make the board. For me, a lot of it has been going into more, for me to gain some more time, I've had to do more retractions and stuff. Retraction of my legs versus like a quick exploding, pop into the air to achieve like some of our tasks and stuff. So I think it does have to come down to like blending of our movement patterns to achieve the board performances we're looking for,
Yeah, thanks, Keith. And we might try to use that later on as an application for something I'm going to present, because yeah, it's real for you. Your fast twitch muscle fibers aren't what they were a few years ago. Cool. That's what it is. And it's like, if we keep training you to just use your fast twitch muscle, use your fast twitch muscle. It's like, that's not the most empowering thing. And in some way we might be limited if we aren't considering legitimate physiology, and if we can troubleshoot or problem solve, then we'll be better off in meeting your needs, I think Claire, and then I'm taking back over.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to share, I feel like my experience with what you're talking about, I'm stoked you're bringing this up because I've actually brought it up with a lot of ladies that I've trained or just had conversations with, that like finding your strength physiologically, or, and then using it and then bringing it to that board performance so that you can not really focus on maybe your weakness, but maybe like transfer that into a strength that you have, and then manifesting whatever trick you're trying to try. So I think that's really awesome. But yeah, I think like in my past experience going through and like learning everything that I've learned, there's so many instructors and so many clinicians that I've had that were like, okay, we'll just pop harder. And you're like, like, how do I do that? Like, exactly. I'm not built the same way. And I'll see somebody just pop really high. And I was like, I can't pop that high. Like, I can try and I'll try my hardest, but like physiologically something might be different with you, and you just might have springy little legs, and I'm trying my best to mimic that, but it's really tough to like adapt to somebody else's style when they're like maybe like a power rider, whereas I'm more of a finesse kind of person, which I had to learn, like dissect from everything that I've been taught. So yeah. Yeah, exactly. Go faster if I want to pop harder. Thanks, Matt. That too.
Yeah, when she said tiny little legs, poppy little legs, she didn't mean anything by it, Tommy. She's not making fun of you.
Those wiry guys.
Those little wiry guys.
Yeah.
Well, no, thanks for jumping in, because again, the community is smarter than the individual, and this is a pretty new concept for me. And I don't mean to at all slight anyone in this group as a coach or a trainer who already brings in physiology, like they're the people's physiology in front of them. In fact, I actually bet a lot of people in this group do. It's more so, I think, system-wide when I was looking at it. And my own experience has been that I don't think my physiology was brought in a lot of my training as I came through the system. So I'm going to put it on the hold in since it's been my own experience. But let's get into it. I want to use myself as a case study to get a little specific and to look in particular at the effects of when you start looking at your own strengths physiologically and when you look at your own weaknesses, and kind of the different approaches I took to those throughout kind of my development. And right before we get into kind of the specifics of my physiology, I'll say that the reason this is pretty real for me is, in particular, the last 5 or 6 years when I hit a certain level. And like Tony was saying, I started getting in front of groups, and all of a sudden the image that I was showing became in some ways under more of a microscope, because I was starting to represent the manual and represent that little human who can move every way perfectly. I started to become aware of my limitations. And when I hit those limitations physiologically that I didn't feel I could change, it became really frustrating. And there were certainly times where I didn't feel like I either belonged, or where I'd just get frustrated or mad, or I'd hide behind my strengths. I'd do different things to kind of manage almost the shame of like, dang, I want to be able to move a little different and I can't. And it wasn't about a movement. It was like, I felt a limitation from my body that was prohibiting a movement that I understood. And a group, being high level educators, high level coaches, one of the effects of that is we're super aware of our own limitations. And so I'm going to put myself out there. There were times I handled it really well, and times where it certainly affected my enjoyment of snowboarding and the enjoyment of educating in snowboarding. And that's really why I want to bring this out there, is to minimize, maybe help other people not go down some of those negative pathways where all of a sudden your physiology can become taking the power away from you, taking the enjoyment of this whole thing away. So that's my motivational statement. Hey, let's talk about me. So here's my physiology. 6'2". I got a big old head. I've got size 13.5 feet. I have limited ankle mobility. I've had some injuries to both ankles that became chronic. So actually you can measure, like, my ankle doesn't bend as much as norm. My hips are about as limited in flexibility as you can have as an adult. When I was running cross country at a university, they told me I was the least flexible athlete at the university. So I had that going for me. So there's some physiology there, limited flexibility, and I have anterior pelvic tilt. This is all part of my reality. Yet at the same time, my quads are ridiculous. I'm quadzilla. I have huge quads, huge ego as well. So those are both strengths physiologically. I can generate a hell of a lot of power. That's a strength of my body. I got a lot of muscle, not necessarily muscles, but like in general, I'm pretty dense. So power is cool for me physiologically. And I got a set of lungs that do really cool things for me. So that's who I am, speaking both in a detrimental way and if I'm looking at myself real. And that's what I have had to work with as a snowboarder coming through the AASI system. Some of that is genetic. A lot of that's genetic. Height, center mass, these ridiculous flippers for feet that I have. Flexibility is in my family. My brother's been made fun of by trainers for being inflexible. And some of it's generated. I've spent my whole life doing endurance sports, which doesn't breed like flexibility. I didn't grow up in a place where stretching was like a thing. So either way, at this point at 35 years old, that's pretty much how my body is. And when we talk about anterior pelvic tilt, you can actually look at my top quad, the rectus femoris quadricep, and it is shorter than average for my height. So if you shorten the quad that goes from the leg and attaches up here and it gets shorter, it pushes your butt out. Cool. Anterior pelvic tilt. Awesome. It is what it is. So I wanted to share a couple stories about how this physiology was kind of called out as I was going through trainings. My very first year instructing, I was training a lot with Rob Baker, kind of OG trainer. He was lead guy at Keystone, and we were out training, and I was riding a normal board, but I had 13 and a half feet and a 13 and a half boot. And he used to have me carve in front of the clinic group to show people what toe and heel drag was. And he would count down. He'd be like, Brennan, go do some large radius carves. And he'd count down 3, 2, 1, and I'd blow up. And he'd get in the group and kind of laugh. But I thought it was fun, being 22, I was the center of attention. But it actually it was frustrating too, because I'm like, I can't change the size of my feet. I was like rocking risers in my gear and doing all this different stuff. But he did call out my physiology. And Rob was an amazing trainer. In this case, I'm kind of teasing him a bit. But what effect did that have on me when that physiology came out? When I was 22 and there, what it did is he told me, you're going to have to figure it out. I was like, how can I carve without booting out? He's like, you're going to have to figure it out. So the effect of a trainer bringing in a physiological consideration was that I went out and I played a bunch. I went through a ton of repetition, trial and error to figure out what would work for me. Years later, Tony alluded to this. I'm in like an RMT clinic. I think Cert 3 going for RMT. And I'm following Macri, and all of you guys know Macri, his hips, they just work. My hips don't do what his does. He's riding low to the ground. I'm trying to do the same. I come down on like some short radius and I'm feeling like a champ. He's like, what are you doing? What do you mean? What am I doing, Tony? He's like, why are you trying to ride like me? Which for the rest of us in the room, we're like, because you're Tony, like, why wouldn't we try to ride like you? You're the dude. But then he followed it up with, look, dude, I'm short and flexible. You're powerful and tall. Leverage the fact that you're powerful and tall. And you want to talk about like mentally what that did for me? It was like, oh my God, I had permission to not just try to keep getting lower and lower and lower. And the things you hear, just get lower, Brennan, get lower. I'm like, the flexibility of my body, unless you tell me how, like years of that had built up. And all of a sudden I had the Tony, which we all have our Tony in the world, say, stop trying to do that. Like leverage your strength, develop your weakness. What was the effect of that? Well, mentally it was better. The other effect of it was I started hiding behind my strengths. I started riding taller and I started riding with power all the time. So that was also an effect from Tony's stories, that I kind of started maybe hiding behind the strengths. So it's kind of a couple of stories on what that physiologic, like when trainers did call it my physiology, but when I actually look at my own trajectory, and in particular, the times where it got difficult and how I approached my physiology is with respect to my strengths, kind of being a strong, powerful guy. One thing I did over the years was I leveraged them. Cool. I can ride at intensity pretty well. Carves are awesome. That's great. Things like the pipe and the jumps, sweet. That works well with all those physiological constraints for me. The other thing that started to happen though is I would hide behind those strengths. So Claire brought up power versus precision. I lived in the power world and I sacrificed precision for years because I could, and I trained that physiology to its limitation. And that's eventually what happened with my strengths. They became limitations because that's all I went with. A cliff got tall enough that I couldn't just absorb from an inefficient stance anymore. I needed a lower edge angle on firm snow and I couldn't just drive an edge through it. So even when I tried to leverage my strengths, I hit a limitation. What did I do with my physiological challenges? First thing, when I look at my path, there were times when I just accepted them. So the classic thing for me that is ultra hard is down unweighting, heel to toe. It's brutal. I hate it. I hate demoing it. And yet there's times where I'd just be like, okay, when I look at how I approach it, I just kind of accept it and been like, my down on weight's just going to be good enough. It's not ever going to be great. So acceptance was kind of a mental process I used to approach my physiology. Covering them is something that happened when I started, like I have a pretty big stance challenge, just being broken at the waist. And I'd use things like retraction to bring my board back under me. So I learned how to cover some of my weaknesses with strengths. Like, oh, I can be quick and get my board back, or I can just be stronger. So even if I'm broken at the waist, I can deal with it. And then the last thing that happened with my own headspace with respect to physiology is that it ultimately just frustrated me. And it took me a while to get there. It really took towards like RMT and starting to lead trainings and groups to feel a higher level of insecurity with the image I was putting out there. And eventually that led to lower satisfaction with snowboarding. So then the final thing and the point of this clinic, when I actually went through this era, and I'm still going through this time of like kind of working with the physiology, the number one tool that actually helped me bring in my physiology in an effective way was actually troubleshooting it. So rather than just hiding behind strengths, rather than, you know, just accepting weaknesses in my physiology or limitations, I started playing with how can I troubleshoot this? Just like Keith was saying with fast twitch, how can I actually problem solve? Because my body is what it is, but maybe I can still achieve those board performances that people were bringing up. So one example of this is that down on weight. So with down on weight, I'm a broken at the waist kind of guy. Cool. And if I down on weight from this position, I get inside the turn, we all know what happens, toe side edge builds, and it gets crazy. And when I noticed, like one problem solving, sorry, if you can't quite see me here, example is I noticed I was down on weighting with that back leg tuck, that little femur, that Geary Watts going on. And when I tried to down on weight through that, it didn't work. And as soon as I realized if I went into it like cowboy, cowgirl and down on weighted with legs out, all of a sudden I had access to stay over my board and not just gain that high, that kind of that high edge angle. So that's like an example of I still needed to achieve the same board performance and the same outcome, but maybe it looked a little different for me. Like I really like, there's a big difference between when I go into a down and weighted movement with those femurs out versus if one's a little tucked in, man, I start dumping over and looking all sorts of strange. So I know that's a lot to put out there. I want to bring it together with a picture real quick before we turn it over, because I'd love to hear what people are thinking at this point. So give me one sec here. Cool. So this is going to bring back a couple of those ideas of how physiology can come in. Yeah, stroke the ego. Here we go. So this is one of my favorite pictures of me. It's a method, obviously. Here's the deal. If you look at this picture, which I consider like, man, I'm looking good right now. You're like, wow, okay, cool. That's a strength. Do you know why a method is one of my go-to grabs? It's because I have a stance issue, and at takeoff, I'm broken at the waist. So what grab can I do to bring myself back over the board? A method. And if I show you now the before and after picture of this shot, let's get this out there. This was my takeoff position for that same trick. I think if we look at that shot, not nearly as ideal. Here is my landing position for that method. So when we look at those ideas of how does physiology play in and how does different approaches play in, hey, a strength came out of a limitation. Because I'm broken at the waist, I can bring myself and my board back into a balanced position with a method, but then it falls back apart for a landing. So that limitation, in this case, that problem solving leads to a strength. Like, hey, pretty cool looking grab, man, but also a challenge. Like, man, if I'm not on a smooth pipe wall, that landing position is not going to be ideal for me. That's going to be real challenging. So that's just one example of how kind of physiology can play in and how I kind of navigated some of my own physiological strengths and challenges. So I guess I would love to kind of throw it back out and see what people are thinking at this point, kind of general questions on ideas presented or where you've experienced this as well.
Yeah,
Really, KB here. Quick question. It seems like you've made a lot of adjustments on snow to minimize or hide your weaknesses. What are you doing off snow to to help that?
Yeah, I'd love to say that I've committed to like a full stretching routine, and I have. I've done like 3 or 4 different rounds of physical therapy. Tried to train a lot of internal rotation of the femurs is something I've worked on. With ankle mobility, some of it's structural, I can't, but stretching the calves to increase it. Little things like that, but not an overhaul. I don't think I've ever achieved like a super measurable change in like stretching out those quads to get that pelvis more neutral or gaining a ton of flexibility through that ankle joint. So to answer your question, not enough, probably.
So can I challenge you to stick to a routine for the next 30 days? You're quarantined anyway. See what the results are.
I mean, you took your shirt off earlier on camera in front of us. You can get me to do anything right now. Yeah, no, absolutely. Let's do it. I'll check in with you. I'll send you a text each day once it's done.
Yeah, let me jump in here because it just totally building off of that. So my background is in medicine, and I was going to say pretty much what Kevin said, but first, Brennan, I love this. Like I said, my background's in medicine. We are all different, so I just absolutely love this. And I like that Kevin challenged you on that because I think it is worth keeping in the back of our mind what of these differences are like innate and we can't do anything about them, and which ones can we kind of modify. And I'll give myself as an example. So I have anterior pelvic tilt as well. And over time, my like lumbar spine and my thoracic spine have kind of compensated for that. And now I have pretty bad neck issues. So, you know, maybe like earlier, maybe I should have been stretching those like psoas and, you know, the fronts of my legs. So anyway,
Yeah.
Maybe I should do the challenge with you.
Let's do it. Let's exchange emails. We'll email out that chain. And yeah, and Brandon, I guess my point is when we handle our candidates, our trainees, our own physiology in a healthy way, it's empowering, but it's pretty easy like to have it also feel pretty limiting. And we all have our limitations. That's part of being human. Like Keith's saying, he doesn't have as much fast twitch muscle. I got a huge head. Cool. That is what it is. And yet if we can kind of problem solve with people that we're coaching or training, potentially we have fewer moments where it becomes kind of that negative emotional response.
Yeah. I mean, for sure, we're all different and there are certain things we just can't change.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have a herniated disc as well in the neck. So you and I are doing a lot of things. Oh yeah, lots of fun. Cool.
All right, Allie, you are up next.
Hi, I also super love this topic and I'm really excited. My background was in athletic training, and that's what I did right before I got into instructing, and like the whole world of it kind of came together super clearly, or just like, I don't know, just made a lot of sense because I had that kind of background of the physicality of it beforehand. And so one of the things that when I moved out to Boreal and Woodward, like the biggest straw was actually with the Woodward piece, where I see a lot of those movements in the physicality piece that gets limited on snow. And there's kind of 2 big ways that we'll see that, and that's the functional piece or the mechanical piece. And the mechanical is what you're born with. That's the stuff you can't really change. The functional is the stuff that you've maybe let yourself get to. And so with like a lot of ours, like all of us probably see a lot of first timers and like newbies coming up who are not real athletic and fit. And I really love being able to include pieces at the end of the lesson, giving them homework on what those exercises are that maybe that's the piece that they're missing. I love it when they have their own snowboard equipment, so I can be like, great, take this home and practice, you know, just that ankle flexion in your boots. Get used to it with your bindings on, sitting up and standing up and sitting down with the board on, and all those extra pieces that they don't usually have. And then when it comes to overall alignment and how much that can affect your reference position and how that changes your center of mass over the board, which then affects the board performance, and kind of goes down that rabbit hole. And so I do a lot of like physical therapy exercises myself just because I know the background and I know my body. I throw out my back all the time if I don't keep my core and my hip strength up. And so when I'm especially like weak or not paying attention, one of the biggest places I'll notice that is in my switch riding, because it doesn't allow my front hip to do my internal rotation, like pull the front of my weight to the front of my board the way I need it to, that I can on my left side. But it's because my strength is my right hand and left foot dominant. So my power is that diagonal across my body. and not this way. So to bring my right hip forward, I need to work on that a lot, and I need to do it off snow. And so I'd wonder if anyone else has anything like working with different types of people, or anyone else that they've been able to do those exercises and give them some homework, or just, you know, like what body areas, what muscles might you be able to work on off snow that will then improve your on snow. And another one of the big ones that I found a huge value out of for me was fast feet. When I first started instructing, I had gotten pretty lazy and not done those sports in a while. And then once I started doing skateboarding and kind of getting into that, and then playing some soccer again, that involved those fast feet, like all of my dynamic snowboarding, how I felt on the snow, and like my playfulness improved and changed so dramatically that it was just incredible. So kind of a whole bunch of things, but yeah, just wondering if anyone else has any thoughts or opinions on those.
Well, you're already getting some responses down in the chat, and it's cool to hear you offer a solution. Like when you're student facing, we can influence our students' physiology in general. Like we work with people who might not be as active as us, so having things like just general workout, general strength will give them more muscle mass, which they can access to have big changes in their riding. And I love that. I'd be curious, with the group, if you want to keep throwing chat ideas down at Ali, or when it comes to ourselves, where we do have the additional pressure of presenting a specific image. And I do think that's different. Our students don't necessarily have to look a certain way, and sometimes we sort of do. So how we approach that as well. So I know Spicky's been waiting for a while, so we might lose Ali's question, but either way, it's good.
All right, can you guys hear me? Awesome. So what I wanted to share with this entire kind of story is that when I was going through my certification process, I broke both my legs and I busted my hip. So I broke both my legs one year and I busted my hip the year before that. And so that's when I went from riding directional to a duck stance, because that's kind of what we were starting to get into. So we could give appropriate demos for the people, you know, that we were getting more duck stances coming out. I'm old, if you haven't got this yet. But long story boring is what I had to go to is like when I went for my RMT, me and Jonathan Hirschberger were one of the first RMTs to go through the process. They didn't like how I looked, but the board performance was there. And so you can't argue, like board performance is king. You know, how you get there is queen. And I'm sorry, we will always talk about that. And I mean, if you can make it happen on the board, I mean, there's no discussion about it. Whether or not you can change up how you look, that's a whole nother story. That's going to change a 6 to a 4 and vice versa. How much you can change up that variation to change it up for a demonstration for a student. You know, so all that stuff is like, I just want to give my 2 cents on this is like, I've come down a long road and I've made a lot of changes, and riding duck stance was one of the biggest things. And so anyways, I guess kind of what I'm getting to is like board performance is king and how you get there is queen. And that's the way that we should be looking at this. That's my 2 cents.
It's really awesome to hear that, Spicky. And I didn't realize you had all that going on with your history. And it just ties back into Matty V's point, though. That's one of the beauties of our sport is that we have different style. Like all of us are going to look different on a board, and a big driving factor in that is physiology, as much as the specific movements we've trained over time. And as long as the board is doing what the rider wants it to do, it is hard to argue with that.
Well, and can I just add two seconds to that? And basically what it comes down to is intention. You know, I mean, we always look at certain aspects as being negative or being, what do I say, non-efficient or non-effective. But there's a point where those actually become effective in what we're trying to intend to do. The beginner doesn't have that aspect. So the beginner is always going to be aft. The beginner is always going to be broken at the waist. The beginner is always going to counter rotate because they aren't edging. What I'm getting at is we can utilize those, and we all do, with intent later. So what we view as something being negative now is something that we all use with intent later. And so I guess kind of what I'm saying is like people kind of get in this whole thing like, oh, you were aft. Well, were they going back up the hill? You know, were they counter rotating? Well, were they on a box? You know, I mean, these are the kinds of things that I don't want people to get stuck in these ruts of these inefficiencies. So.
Looks like we got Lynn going on, I think. Conrad.
Hi. So I want to build on what Spicky just said. So my question for everybody is the movement that seems like it might be the most ineffective movement for one person be the most effective movement for the other person. The reason that I'm saying this is I was working on something for my toe to heel turn to make sure I was retracting instead of up unweighting at the very end of the finish in the bumps. And I noticed, and I couldn't figure it out. So I watched video. I hit some of you guys up for video. Brennan was one of the people I asked. But I had a video of like 5, 6, 7 people, and everyone makes a different movement. One person used their lower spine and made a huge movement there. One person got down a lot lower and made a big movement with their femur rotating their front hip socket. Another person used their upper spine for something. Everyone did different things to achieve the same movement option. Nobody looked the same, but everybody got the same performance in terms of retraction and board performance. So I really like how you talked about attributing physiology to certain movements and certain timing, Brennan.
Yeah, and not knowing the full picture there, Lynn, what I'm hearing is that the outcome was retraction and people did it with maybe proportional differences. Because like retraction, no matter what, is going to be the board being brought up towards the body. And some people were doing that from different places or with additions of movement. But I would go back to like what Spicky's saying, if this isn't maybe an exam environment or an outcome environment, like in the race course or something where we're looking for a retraction to help an athlete out, if the board was doing what the desired outcome was, that would be the clarifier for which of those movements might be being used the most effective, if that makes sense.
You might do one thing and Spicky might do the other thing, but you get the same performance and the same outcome.
Sweet. We got Rogers up next.
Right on. Yeah, I think just wrap up what I like tie into what Spicky was saying. I think it's one of the strengths of where we're going with the snowboard fundamentals is looking at the connection between body movements and board performances. And I think especially in Rocky Mountain, there was, I think people lost sight of the idea that it's not about tasks. It's about movements and board performances. And, you know, when you're doing, whether it's toe to toes or dolphin turns or large radius carve turns, it really doesn't matter what the task is. The examiners and your trainers are working around movements and creating outcomes with those movements. And that board performance, that body movement, that it's going to look different, right? It's going to look different from Brennan's tall, lanky body to Tony's flexible body to my more stocky build. Like, it's going to look different among different snowboarders, but retraction is retraction, down on weighting is down on weighting, right? The upper and lower body separation is upper and lower body separation. Carving is carving, twist is twist. Like those fundamentals of snowboarding that are outlined in the 6 fundamentals really create a good framework for that. And I think it's really key that we get beyond training for tasks and being specific about tasks and recognizing that tasks are highlighting or blending or applying all of those movements to let your examiners, let your trainers see movements and help you get better at them.
Yeah, it's huge. And we're going to be hearing a lot more about the fundamentals in the coming years. That's coming down, already out in the tech manual, but I appreciate Raj that idea because I hadn't thought about them in that way. As a benefit of defining some fundamentals is that it's connecting them without being ultra specific, like body and board, without being ultra specific about the body. I still think we're going to see some common ground through most things, but to your point, yeah, it might offer a little more flexibility there. Yeah.
Sweet. Amy Gann.
Just to add to what you guys were all saying, although Brennan kind of just wrapped it up, looking at what Lynn was saying with like how we can make retraction happen. Yeah, we are all making it happen in different ways. And then it's that versatility for the standard, which is what I actually really like about our standard, is that as long as we can do what we need to do to make that happen in different spots, like say my hip's really not working today and I really can't do that like hard pull to get the board up to me. If I can make the board, you know, respond in a variety of different spots across the mountain to get it to pop up to me so I don't have to do that pulling motion, then it's going to work. And so that is just kind of how I look at it all working together and how we can make different things work for us. Even though one thing might not be working, we can use a different tool.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. Yeah, and I guess it feels good to hear the openness in this room, this group, on really looking at the board as a bottom line and being open to differences in physiology. I still think there's a reality of certain physiologies are maybe more natural for some of the movement options we ask for in our system. And I think sharing the first idea that the group seems to be really kind of coming together on, which is, hey, the board's the bottom line. There is a range of appearance that can be okay, as long as your board's doing what you want. That's great. That's true, and share that with your principal audience, your students, your trainees, et cetera. But I still think there's times when we're going to help people with different physiologies sort of troubleshoot things. So like I gave the example of the down on weight and like where my femurs are rotating is going to impact a lot. And that's a physiological thing because I'll dump over at the waist. Another example would be like toe side absorption is super demanding for me because I have a tendency to break at the waist. Like my hips are definitely more flexing than my knees and my ankles. Obviously then when I start getting some variable terrain on the toes, it's easy to tip over and blow out. So like, how do I problem solve that? I flatten my lower spine going into the turn. So before I go into the toes, I make sure that butt goes back down. So then at least I have some element of being over the board so that I can absorb through my center of mass. That's like another example of kind of idea of problem solving, where someone else who might have that more neutral pelvis might not have to have that as a focus, just strictly based on physiology.
Sweet. Chandler, and then Spicky.
Kind of one of my biggest takeaways was actually from Hargrave. We were riding at Mammoth at a convention and working on like looking at the board and finding the root cause of cause and effect of how the body is going to make an outcome for the board performance. And just looking at the board and then moving your way up and looking at the body performances that would break it down, really just kind of visualize stuff that would just analyze everything, every single body movement, no matter what's going on, understanding the physiology of that, like just really understanding how that board performance delivered an outcome, and that was really helpful.
Coach Hargrave. A lot of us have been coached by Hargrave.
Hargrave. Spicky, you are up next.
So kind of what I wanted to bring up was I've worked with a lot of taller people. I mean, everybody's taller than me. I'm like 5'7". My wife says 5'6", but I'll argue that. But anyways, long story boring. What I've found is like I've always jacked up the forward lean, and that's not always to a benefit, especially on steeper terrain, especially with carving and stuff like that. And so kind of what I've come down to is, we always see that broken at the waist with taller riders on steeper terrain, especially trying to carve. And so, I mean, the con about it is that they're basically in one movement, as far as the extreme of their movement, they flex as far as they can. So they can't really move out of that. But if they do it with intent, I mean, it's okay. I mean, obviously they don't have the ass saving maneuvers available to them if their base of support was directly underneath their center of mass. But what I'm getting at is like at a higher level rider, especially higher level riders that are taller, they know what they're working with. And so being broken at the waist is not necessarily a bad thing. And that's something that I've noticed that higher level trainers really kind of harp on, is like, oh, you're broken at the waist. Are you achieving the topic? Yes, you are. But then they start going for efficiency and they're sitting there saying you're broken at the waist. Well, maybe that's the way for that to happen. And they've come to a point as far as synthesizing the information to understand what they need to do and when they need to do it for their body type. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I fully agree, Spicky. And it's, I find myself more and more when we're talking with people about that classic flexed at the weight, like proportion of it, asking exactly that to achieve things. When does your specific posture become a limitation? When can we complement it with other movements? Is it that we're flexing a little or a lot? etc. And then Spicky brought up gear, and that was another way that I've kind of problem solved some things for myself. I went like stiffer gear for a while because I'm a big mountain rider. I got to ride big boards and stiff bindings and stiff boots. And it turns out when you take away someone's ankle movement or minimize it just a little bit with stiff boots, stiff bindings, and a big board, and they already flex a lot at the waist, well, guess what? I'm not absorbing much with my ankle. So then it actually increased that challenge. And it took me a few years to back off of that. And just riding a couple notches, kind of less stiff overall, like more mid to mid stiff flexing boards instead of ultra stiff has been another thing to Spicky's point that we can do. For people who might have that classic problem of like that broken at the waist, is give them more movement down low mechanically with gear alterations.
Sweet. Steve Rosenthal.
Sweet. Yeah, Brennan, thank you for sharing. Yeah, the first time I noticed this was actually riding with KB, because I don't know if you've noticed, but we have a different body type between the two of us. But something with that is being able to identify it. And I think, you know, like hearing your story and the progression of it is like, it took a long time for you to hear from Tony, stop riding like Tony. And it took a long time for you to understand, cool, power is my go-to move. And then it took you a longer time to figure out, okay, since I have power, I need to work on the finesse, the other elements included there too. So I think as trainers, as evaluators in the roles that we have, is that we need to be able to identify that. And we need to let our students or our instructors or our friends, whoever we're riding with, we need to let them know sooner within their riding career of like, hey, these are some things that you can do really great. These are some things that you're gonna have to work on a lot more. These are, you know, this is KB's like workout routine for you to get stronger. That, you know, all of that kind of stuff needs to come out a little bit earlier, rather than when you're going for your RMT, or rather than your third shot at your full cert, you know, rather than at the evaluation. This should not be the first time that you hear, Brendan, you're a tall dude, KB, you're more muscular than me, that kind of stuff. So.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I think naturally we train movements and we try to help people coordinate movements because fundamentally that is our sport. Human beings move and their board does shit. Cool. And you're right. If we can build in additional training early on bigger picture items that are going to influence all the movements, specifically from physiology, that would have helped me personally. And I imagine I'm not alone in that from what we're hearing here and observations outside. Thanks, Steve.
Is there anybody else who wants to jump in? There's 2 pages here, so I've been scrolling back and forth. Oh, Chris, yes, sorry, you're up next.
Hey, so a couple things as Brennan was talking, I was thinking about ankle flex, and it's funny because when I was going for my level 3 cert Alpine, I had a trainer way back when, like in the 90s, tell me that I didn't bend my ankles very well, and I think she was right. So I went out and bent my ankles all the time so much that I ended up breaking the cuffs on my ski boots. And I remember thinking, all right, now I've overcome this limitation, which is so funny because they just got stuck in this forward position. It was so fun. But now even in my snowboard boots, I find that I ride my boots loose. I have, unless I'm like really going for it in the pipe or something, which, you know, is pretty rare, but I ride them loose because I like the movement. I like to feel things more. I really do. And it brings me back to this whole thing of, you know, where kind of something that you said, Brennan, triggered me in thinking that, you know, like there's a lot of talk about like these expected movements, but then at the end of the day, it's really, we just have to make movements that help the rider or you specifically feel things that you want to feel things that feel good, create sensations on the snow, like pumping through a transition, like milking a turn in the bumps, and all these things that we like to do that feel so amazing. And you just need enough movement to effectively accomplish those things. I mean, as long as we're getting a sensation that's good, that's positive, through the movement we can make, then we're going to keep doing it. And I would imagine, you know, Brendan, I've seen you ride, so you're like overselling this limitation thing quite a lot because it's like it doesn't really affect your riding that much. Your giant head might get stuck between the trees in Colorado because they're really tight together, but your overall riding is incredible. And I don't really, you know, there's some limitations there, but that you've identified, but those are just, you know, mild limitations in terms of your overall success. I mean, look at how successful you've been able to be with the range of motion that you have and your ability to move in the ways that you can to create those sensations. And I mean, I know that on any given day, if we go out ride powder together, I'm going to be hungry for like all that build up and release of energy that I get out of digging deep into a toe side turn, for example. And you're going to want that and hunger for it too. I mean, we all want to drag a hand and throw a big roost of snow out like Craig Kelly used to, and that sort of thing. So I think it really comes back to, are we training people to ride big ranges of motion because that's what we expect of them? Or are we training people to create ranges of motion that are effective and create sensations that they really want, they desire, that they want to repeat? You know, I think these exam tasks so often, you know, we put them in a box, and years ago, before exams transitioned to more environmental and experiential, you know, there were task lists, you know, in almost every division, and you'd force people to do these tasks, and you'd expect them to look a certain way and accomplish this set thing, when in reality, what we really ought to be hungering for is creating an environment where people get to feel things and execute things that are fun, feel good to do, not force square pegs into round holes, so to speak, in those exam environments that are I mean, it's just very intimidating and really ineffective in terms of overall snowboard experience and fun. So, sorry, I'm up here soapboxing. I'll make my point, and it's just simply that you need movement to create feelings, and as long as those feelings are good, who gives a shit how much movement you can make? Let's just go out and apply things that make our snowboard do things that feel good and that we want to keep doing. And if we want to keep doing it, we're going to keep doing it. And that's the beauty of snowboarding. I'm just looking for those sensations. And Brennan, back to you, riding with you all these years, I don't know, you were like 13 years old the first time I met you. And all these years of knowing you, just, I can see the joy in everything that you do as a snowboarder. So I think you're doing it right, man. And I think you're overcoming those limitations. And it's awesome that you recognized it and you can compensate for it, and that you can share that with your students now moving forward, you know, and help them overcome those situational disadvantages. So anyways, thanks. Good job, man.
No, it's always good to hear you speak, Chris, especially with your perspective on the evolution of everything. You know, because we have a lot of different generations in this online forum right now, and we all have our own context. So I love that you break that down. I think you hit on something that goes back to a Tony Macri quote, which is like, there's a big difference between maximize range of motion in general. Like, you have to ride as flexed as anyone could ride, or as tall as maximize your range of motion. And I hear you saying that as trainers, coaches, we should be cognizant of that, as like your range of motion for that fun feeling, for that Craig Kelly, for that outcome. And if I hope that message is getting out there to the membership, because there's certainly times where I think it kind of gets mixed up.
All right, we got KB, Cody, and then Claire. And after that, we'll start wrapping it up.
Thanks. Brennan, awesome topic. I know I am probably one of the guys on the upper end of physiology when it comes to, I'm 6'1", I'm 250. I would say my quads are huge, yours are big, but it's interesting the things we're talking about, because we talk about limitations so much, and we're really looking for board performance and maximizing what your body can do. I do believe in our process for a while that was overlooked, and it's good to hear that we're getting more back to board performance instead of how you look per se. But I would also challenge you, I forget the girl who said it, the functional versus mechanical, because again, there's a lot of functional pieces that and riding with you this year, you've seen it, where I've improved some of those quote unquote limitations based on working on them off of snow. I've gotten more range of motion in my ankles. I've gotten more range of motion in my hips. It is doable. It's challenging, but I would challenge you to go see what those limitations actually are, and if they are limitations, because I challenge myself to that right now.
Thanks, KB. Yeah, we've seen that progression as you're working on it on and off snow, for sure.
Cody.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask kind of the group at large. There's a person that I work with who has been trying to go for his 3 for a while, and he's a pretty tall guy, so he has a lot of vertical movement capability, but his weight kind of prohibits him from being able to use that vertical movement. What are some tactics that you guys would probably kind of use to help that person kind of achieve some of the outcomes that we are looking for at that level 3 standards? like when it comes to like troubleshooting what he has an issue with, how can we kind of overcome that?
I want to hear from the group on this one. We got a lot of level 3 examiners from around the country on this call right now.
Hey, could you reframe the question for me? Just repeat it one time, because my kids were yelling in the background. Sorry.
Yeah. So I have a coworker who is fairly tall, but he also has a lot of weight behind him. And so that kind of limits his vertical movements, and it kind of prohibits him to be able to get some of the performance that we look for in some of the level 3 tasks. And with this idea of the physiological kind of problems that we might kind of encounter, how can we kind of troubleshoot this and overcome that issue of not having the ability to use his vertical movement that he might be able to if he weighed less?
Yeah, so I'm hearing like in general, just higher center mass and a lot of center mass, like a lot of mass.
Yeah.
My immediate response is those ankles and knees are going to become key, because once that larger center mass is away from center, is away from over the board, pressure management is going to become challenging because we're going to build big edge angles real quick. That's my instant coaching.
Yeah, I would add on to that and just say that, you know, feel comes through the lower legs. I mean, unless you've got a condition like MS or something where you can't feel your feet and your lower legs or your hands or something like that, the ability to bend the ankles is what connects us to our board. And the more he can start to develop that range, and it may be weak in the beginning, but he has to spend time developing it so that he can create that feel and that connection of getting the foot, you know, down into the boot and connecting with the whole foot on the board at times. And the taller he is, the more he's going to start to rely on leverage and big movements, which there's a lot of power in that. I mean, you look at like the Aussies, their system. I mean, there's so much power in these big up and over and leveraged out movements. And they're very effective in certain places in a certain way. I mean, I love playing with that. I mean, going to China, I know Tony spent a bunch of time in China too. Like some of the other guys on the call probably have been over there, but you'll watch young kids over there and they literally learn how to carve first. They can't even skid a turn. They just ride these super high edges. It's the craziest thing. You'll just watch them going down a beginner trail doing this. Wow, wow. It's like blows my mind. And I'm going, I can't even do that. Like I felt so inadequate in China and I was like, all right, fine. I'm going to learn how to do what they're doing. And it was really fun to do it. But, you know, he's going to have that coworker of yours is really going to have to learn how to create strength in his lower legs and get moving in that direction.
I think Corey had something to say, maybe Chandler, and then after Claire, we'll wrap this up.
Zachary was going to just tie into that question real quick, and then we'll go down and finish up. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess just to that question, if you look at anybody who's familiar with Hank, he works at I used to work at Beaver Creek. Big guy, super quick ankles, quick feet. Here's a guy who was successful doing just exactly what Chris was just talking about.
Hey,
was somebody else going to talk?
Hey, Chris.
Just something else on that real quick. I think it's important to recognize, and I don't know, you know, who this individual is specifically, but it's not always a popular thing to say, but I think it's important at this level that we recognize that full cert isn't for everyone. It does take work, and people aren't always willing to put that work in. And I think you know, there's ways to train, and there's opportunities to train, and there's, you know, people in this group are passionate about helping people get to those levels. You know, and not everyone gets a doctorate. Not everyone gets a master's degree. Not everyone gets their bachelor's degree. Not everyone gets an associate's degree. There's reasons that there are tiers to our certification. And as much as we are all passionate about helping people develop and train and get to those levels, and there's so many examples of the success of people who have put in the work and have changed and made sacrifices and made adaptations to use strengths to overcome or to hide weaknesses or deficiencies like Brennan was talking about. But it's important to also know that sometimes the right feedback to give is you're going to have to put in the time and you're going to have to work at it. And there's a point where there is no other alternative. There is no just easy fix. You're going to have to put in time. You're going to have to drop weight. You're going to have to build muscle. You're going to have to work on ankle flexion. And if someone's not willing to do that, that may be where their ceiling vertically in PSIA and AASI is, and they can look at lateral movements into kids education, into freestyle education, you know, the different areas that we have opportunities to move laterally.
Sweet. That was a good point there, Chris. Let's go to Claire. Corey, Chandler, I think, had a little piece. We'll try to finish it up here shortly.
Okay, sorry. It takes me a second to figure out where the mute button is. Anyways, I just wanted to say, love the talk, Brennan, super awesome. Something that the training that I've done over the years, the things that really stick out in my mind, a lot is Tony's training, because he helps identify, he like pinpoints specific like joints that we're moving at a time. And that's always helped me kind of identify what muscles or like what joints might be working better than others to get their specific board performance. And I think that when we train our peers to, you know, achieve a higher level in certification, that doing stupid human tricks to get them to identify their own strengths and weaknesses is super important. And I think sometimes a lot of trainers or a lot of trainers that I've had in the past have like really tried to get to the task and like train to the task, but not necessarily to train for like every body movement you can get to that task. And I think that's really important when we go through training is, you know, more stupid human tricks, more identifying tiny muscle movements, tiny movement patterns that might benefit people to take it to that like essential board performance.
Yeah, 100%. It's like, you want to get better at that task, then let's go do 100 other things to get you better at the skills and then go do that task. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
Corey.
So what I was going to say was, obviously bringing it down to the lower body, Cody, with your friend, and then having him try and isolate each joint specifically so that he can feel like what he is doing, and then maybe having somebody watch. So, you know, if he can't really feel something, having an outside source tell him, but also playing with his stance. You know, for larger people, sometimes like a much wider stance and like wider feet, depending on how your hips are going to allow you to get that range of motion.
Sweet. Chandler.
Yeah, cool, Cody. I think I know who you're talking about, but a lot of time when you get the upper body heavy, you need to squat more and never be like fully extended and get like lock-legged, because you get bucked around. But you need to build your lower leg muscles way stronger. Like, you need to get up and ride, and if you're not riding, you need to do squats or do something, because if you're just not riding as much or you're not really working out your lower body, then it's going to be very tough on you, especially when you get, you know, into that riding crud and stuff like that. So he needs to just get out and ride a lot more.
Well, thank you everyone for participating in a topic that's pretty real and obviously personal to me, and also pretty new as a training tool. So awesome to see the chats and stuff. I really dig what was going on. Conrad, take us home.
Yeah, just want to say thank you very much, Brennan, for presenting. Thanks to Tony for presenting as well tonight. Good stuff, guys. We had over, I think, 30 people here at the height of the thing, so that was sweet to see everybody here and engaging. Thanks to everybody in the comments. If you guys have any questions or anything that you want to follow up on with this topic or any of these topics presented tonight, the Facebook page will be up, so go ahead and put your thoughts on there. If Tony could put that thing that his little slideshow up on that Facebook group, that would be cool too. I think next session